Hours and hours go by, and there is still no sign of Julie. What began as a hopeful search soon spiraled into every parent's worst nightmare. How could a vibrant young woman disappear with no one even noticing? As her family and the community fought to uncover the truth, this case took twists and turns that shocked even the most seasoned detectives. What happened to Julie Connell that day in the park? That answer would take decades to uncover. But first, let me introduce you to Julie Connell. Imagine that friend that you always look up to, the one who has everything figured out. They're smart, put together, and full of potential. That was Julie. She was born on April 15th, 1966, and she was the oldest daughter of Jim and Kathy Connell. And she was born in San Leandro, California. In the 1980s, it was the kind of place where families felt safe leaving their doors unlocked. Nestled in the San Francisco Bay Area, the suburban streets were lined with well-kept lawns, children playing outside, and the comforting sound of neighbors exchanging greetings with one another. For the Connell family, their home at 1593 Vining Street was a haven of love and security. It was a cozy suburban neighborhood, the kind of place where I said kids would go and play outside until the streetlights came on. The biggest neighborhood drama was whose lawn got TP during homecoming, and Julie took full advantage of that stability, focusing on her studies and her hobbies. Right from the start, Julie was an overachiever. She had this quiet determination and a spark about her that made people notice. Her younger sisters, Wendy and Patricia, practically worshipped her. Julie was a straight-A student at Arroyo High School in San Lorenzo, California. And she wasn't just good at school. She was great at school. She was so academically inclined. She was the kind of girl who would make flashcards for fun. Her teachers adored her, and her classmates saw her as someone who they could count on to be kind and genuine. And it wasn't just about the books. Julie was the whole package. She loved writing, acting, and she dreamed of one day being in broadcasting. Now I want you to picture this. It's the 1980s, and Julie's life is like a John Hughes movie, but without the angsty teen drama. She had her high school sweetheart, Tom O'Neill, who was a little older than her. He was 20, he was a college guy, and they were cute. They hung out together all the time, laughed together, and enjoyed each other's company. When Julie turned 18 on April 15th of 1984, that was a huge deal. 18 is the age when you start to feel like, I'm an adult now. She had just purchased her cap and gown for graduation and put a deposit down for a class trip to Disneyland. Julie spent the day with her boyfriend Tom, just celebrating because just a few months earlier, she had been accepted into California State University at Hayward. She had big goals, and honestly, no one doubted that she would achieve all of them. Julie wasn't just book smart, though. She was thoughtful, caring, and she spent time volunteering at her local church, reading Bible stories to kids. She was the kind of person you just felt good being around. Her family, her friends, everyone who knew her saw that she was on the brink of something great. But here's the thing that hits hard. Julie wasn't just a girl with dreams. She was a sister, a daughter, and a friend, like us. And that's why her story really hits home, because Julie could have been any of us, a young woman with her life ahead of her, living her best life, completely unaware of the danger that was lurking in what should have been one of the safest spaces. Her story isn't just about what happened to her, it's about who she was. This vibrant, ambitious girl who deserved to grow up, to live out her dreams, and to see where her life would take her. And knowing her story means we're not just remembering the tragedy, but the person behind it. Julie Connell deserved so much more than what the world gave her. And that's why we're here today, to make sure she isn't forgotten. It was April 20th, 1984, Easter weekend, a time for pastel dresses, egg hunts, and honestly, just soaking up the early spring weather in California. The Connell family had plans for a relaxing, wholesome afternoon. Kathy, Julie's mom, wanted to take her 3 daughters to see the movie Police Academy at the festival cinema, family bonding over popcorn and laughs during spring break. But Julie had already seen it. She had other plans that day. Julie was the type of girl who always had her priorities in order. And while her sisters, 15-year-old Wendy and 12-year-old Patricia, were excited for the movie, Julie decided to use that time to catch up on her schoolwork. College was around the corner, and she wasn't about to slack off now, especially since she had a test on Monday. So she packed her essentials, a book she was reading for class called A Face of a Hero, a blanket, some lunch, and her trusty lavender USA t-shirt paired with blue jeans and white tennis shoes and cute bobby socks. Her style was comfy and practical, which was so Julie. Kennedy Park was just across the street from the movie theater, and that was her destination. It was the perfect spot, a quiet little park where you could stretch out on the grass and get lost in a good book. Julie told her mom, "Pick me up here when the movie's over." And with that, they dropped her off around 1 p.m., never imagining that it would be the last time they saw her. At the park, Julie set up her little study station like a straight-A student would. She spread out her blanket, pulled out her book, and got to work. Her sister Wendy hung out for a bit, waiting for the movie to start. Everything seemed normal, peaceful even. The sun was out, people were around, and it felt like an ordinary day. But when the movie was over and Kathy and the girls went back to the park, Julie wasn't there. At first, it didn't seem like a big deal. Maybe she wandered off to go grab something to eat, or she got bored and she went home early. Kathy searched the park, calling out Julie's name, but there was no sign of her. Not the blanket, not the book, nothing. By the time they got home, Kathy was expecting to see Julie waiting for them, ready with one of those, "Oh, I just decided to leave early" explanations, but the house was silent. Julie wasn't there. And with each passing minute, the worry started to set in. Jim Connell, Julie's dad, got home from work and immediately noticed that something was off. Julie not being there. That wasn't like her. At first, he was annoyed. Why couldn't she have just called, he said, and let us know where she was? But the irritation quickly turned into something darker, a pit in his stomach kind of dread. The Connells started calling everyone they could think of, Julie's friends, her boyfriend Tom, anyone who might have seen or heard from her. But there was nothing. No one had any idea where she was, and by nighttime, the fear had taken over. They tried calling local hospitals, hoping for some sort of news about their daughter, but it was no use. Julie was gone. And when they reached out to the police, they were told the worst thing possible. Because Julie had just turned 18, the police couldn't file a missing persons report for at least 72 hours. Now, I'm sure most of you know by now that that is not true. Not these days. These days, you can 100% file a missing persons report right away. But back then, this was the norm. 72 hours. That's a lifetime when someone you love has gone missing. The police suggested that maybe Julie had run away, or she was just out having fun. But the Connells knew their daughter. Julie wasn't reckless. She wasn't the type to just disappear without telling someone. Something was wrong. Something was terribly wrong. And they just couldn't sit around and do nothing. So they did what any desperate family would do. They organized their own search party, handwriting over 2,000 flyers. They plastered Julie's face across the community, begging for help. They combed through Kennedy Park, every street, every corner of their town, hoping for a clue. And I would do the same thing, and I know many of you would too. That Sunday, Easter morning, the Connells went to church, trying to find some comfort. But during the service, Jim felt something really odd. He felt this cold, heavy wave of despair come over him, and it shook him up. It was like a voice whispering that Julie wasn't coming home. He ended up admitting this later, but in the moment, of course, he kept quiet because he was hopeful, and he moved forward, trying to locate his teenage daughter. But can you imagine? Maybe it was like a gut feeling or some kind of intuitive sense that he had, but still, the family pushed on. There was no other choice. Julie was out there somewhere, and they had to find her no matter what. But they needed help. What had started as a simple spring day had turned into every family's nightmare. They were living a family's worst fears, and the clock was ticking. By the third day, the Connells were running on nothing but adrenaline and pure desperate hope. Julie had been missing for 72 hours now. That's 3 days of searching parks, knocking on doors, and dialing numbers in the middle of the night, praying that someone, anyone, had seen her. 3 days of replaying every detail, asking, "What are we missing?" The police finally agreed to open an investigation, but their initial response was cold, detached, and way too casual. They said she's probably just with friends. Maybe she ran away. And I know that I would be livid. Imagine it being your own daughter, your loved one, the straight-A, responsible, just turned 18, excited about college type of girl. And they were sitting there dismissing her like she was just out partying. Well, the Connells weren't having it. They knew that something was wrong. On Easter Sunday, while all these other families were dyeing eggs and planning family dinners, the Connells were handing out missing persons flyers. Julie's face was everywhere now, in store windows, on telephone poles, even on car windshields. Her father, Jim, was on local television, practically begging the community for help. "We're looking for Julie," he said. "We're not looking for a body. We're looking for our daughter." It wasn't just the family searching. The entire community came together. Strangers showed up with flashlights, with boots on, combing through Kennedy Park and the surrounding neighborhoods. Psychics reached out with visions, and search dogs were brought in to sniff out a trace of Julie. It was a whirlwind of effort, but none of it brought any answers. Then came the first clue. A woman called the police after seeing Julie's disappearance on the news, and she thought she found something. It was a book, thrown into the bushes on her front porch. It was the same book Julie had taken to the park, A Face of a Hero. The woman noticed that the book had been taken out of the Arroyo High School library, which she knew from the news that Julie attended. Recognizing the significance of this discovery, she decided to contact the police. She wondered how it got there. Who just threw it away like that? Surely not Julie. Before detectives could make sense of any of this, another call came in. Another woman and her daughter had been walking not too far from the park when they spotted a lavender shirt and a bra just lying in the street. The shirt matched the one that Julie had been wearing, and the bra was cut down the middle. The straps were ripped. It was the evidence that no one wanted to find, because it meant that something bad could have happened to Julie. When police brought the shirt and the bra to the Connell home, Kathy and Jim could barely look. They knew instantly that they were Julie's. For Jim, seeing the shredded fabric was almost too much. "She's in trouble," he told them, and his voice was breaking. He knew she was really, really in trouble. But even then, the Connells refused to give up until they found her. They had to believe that she was still alive. 2 days later, 2 teenage girls came forward with another clue. Julie's backpack was found. They admitted they found it under a payphone at a 7-Eleven, but they had gone through it. They were admittedly looking for anything valuable and then tossing the other items that they didn't want from their moving car window as they drove away. The teenage girls said that they later saw the news about Julie's disappearance and how she had a backpack with her at the time, and this realization prompted the friends to realize that the bag might hold some important value, some evidence. So when they heard this, they told one of their sisters, and the sister advised them to call the police to tell them what they found. After the police picked up the backpack from the teenage girls, they were able to confirm that it belonged to Julie Connell, and inside was Julie's blanket. But there was nothing else to indicate what happened to her or where she might be now. Each of these clues was like another breadcrumb, a little bit of hope mixed with fear. And then, 5 days after Julie vanished on April 25th, the call that they'd been dreading came in. A rancher and his wife were out tending to their cattle in a remote part of Castro Valley, approximately 20 minutes away from Kennedy Park, where Julie was last seen. The rancher explained that they were there to bring their cattle down from the mountain into a small remote corral, and the couple stumbled upon a shocking sight: the body of a young woman. She was inside the corral, lying in the open, exposed to the elements, and nude from the waist up, clearly no longer alive. They were unable to process what they had just witnessed, but they quickly made the decision to ride to their neighbor's house and call the police. When investigators arrived at the scene, the location itself set an eerie tone. This corral was rugged, it was surrounded by hills and dense brush, and far from any busy roads or residential areas. It was the kind of place that no one would just stumble upon unless they were there for a specific reason. It was isolated, quiet, and unfortunately the perfect location for someone to try to hide a crime. As officers approached the body, it was clear that they were dealing with a homicide. The woman had no identification on her, but the detectives had this gut feeling that it would be Julie Connell. The nude upper part of the body was bruised and bloodied. Her throat was wounded from ear to ear, slashed across. Her left wrist was bound tightly with this elaborate type of knot, wrapped 12 times with some kind of cord. Her right arm was nearly severed. It appeared that the killer had tried to restrain her with such violence that the ligature cut into her flesh. The condition of her body told a very tragic story right away. There were defensive wounds that covered her hands and her arms, a clear indication that she had fought back with everything that she had. There were bruises on her torso and abrasions on her knees, which made it look like she was dragged or thrown down before her life was taken. When they got closer, they realized that her killer had slit her throat 3 times, an act of pure rage, or maybe a deliberate attempt to silence her forever. And I'm sorry I even have to say those words, but this is what happened to her. Investigators combed through that corral, leaving no stone unturned. They worked methodically, moving shoulder to shoulder across the whole field, documenting every inch of that scene. Near the gate to the corral, they discovered muddy footprints on a second rail of the gate. It looked like someone had climbed over the gate. The pattern was distinct enough for them to take note for potential analysis. Now, on the ground near the gate, they found something very chilling. It was a small cellophane package that had once held a disposable scalpel. The packaging had a red smear on it, which they suspected might be blood. Investigators also found several sets of fingerprints on the gate itself, and they hoped that that would lead them to a major lead in the investigation. As they analyzed the soil around the body, it became clear that they had been killed in the corral itself. Blood had soaked deeply into the ground, a quantity that would have been impossible for her body to have been moved there after her death. There were also no drag marks around her, no disturbed grass or dirt to suggest that the body had been transported there. Every piece of evidence pointed to this being the location where her life was taken. Now, despite the lack of proof, the officers at the scene had a gut feeling that this woman could be the missing girl, Julie Connell. At 2 a.m., the Connell family's phone rang. Jim and Kathy Connell answered, and their hearts were heavy with dread. It was a call that no one wanted to get. On the line was a detective from the Alameda County Sheriff's Department. His voice was steady but carried the weight of devastating news. A young woman's body had been found, and they needed the Connells to identify it. They prayed silently because they were hoping that the police had not found their Julie. Next thing they knew, there were officers at their front door. They let them inside, and one of the officers handed them an envelope. Inside were snapshots of a woman's body that had been found. Jim was the first to look. It was Julie. Her features were unmistakable to him, even in the grainy image. The tears came instantly. Jim could hardly bear the weight of this realization that his daughter was gone. "It's her," he whispered. "It's Julie." And then it was Kathy's turn. She was sitting in Julie's room on her bed when they handed her the photos. She too cried as soon as she saw them. Kathy and Jim Connell were devastated, and then the officers handed the parents something else, a dime. It was the only item besides her clothing that was found on her body, a single dime. Kathy had taught all of her daughters to always carry a dime with them because, at the time, that was the cost of a call from a payphone. The Connells were now faced with the additional challenge of breaking the news to their younger daughters, Patricia and Wendy. 12-year-old Patricia, Julie's youngest sister, remembers her mom breaking the news. She said, "Your sister is dead." And she was holding her hand. And she said that she knew what that meant in the moment. She struggled to make sense of it, though. What did it even mean? What was she supposed to do now, she wondered. For Wendy, the last family member to see Julie alive, the guilt and the grief were overwhelming. She kept replaying the last moment in her mind countless times. Julie, lying peacefully on her blanket, completely unaware of what was about to unfold. The loss shattered this family. She was the glue holding their family together. The big sister Wendy and Patricia adored, the girl who brought joy into every room she walked into. And now she was gone. For Jim and Kathy, the grief was unbearable. But somehow, they managed to keep going. For Wendy, and for Patricia, and for Julie. They didn't just want justice, they needed it. Whatever happened to Julie, whoever did this to her, they weren't going to let it end here. But their nightmare had only just begun. Julie Connell's body was transported from the corral in Castro Valley to the Alameda County Coroner's Office, where the full scope of the violence she endured finally came to light. The autopsy revealed a brutal story, a grim narrative of her final hours that underscored the monstrous cruelty that her killer carried out. For the investigators and her family, the report was both a source of heartbreak and also a critical piece in this puzzle for justice. The medical examiner determined that Julie's cause of death was exsanguination, and I've talked about this before. It's just another word for massive blood loss. It resulted from the 3 deep cuts to her throat. These wounds were not random. One cut severed her carotid artery, ensuring that she would not survive long after the attack, and there were defensive wounds on her hands, forearms, and shoulders. She had likely used her arms to shield her face and throat. The slashes crisscrossed her skin. They were evidence of her desperate attempt to fend off this attacker. Her right arm had been nearly severed, an injury that actually horrified the detectives when they saw it. The cut was so deep, it detached her forearm from the rest of her body. Julie's left wrist was tightly bound with that knot I told you about. It was complex and meticulous. The medical examiner noted that the knot wasn't improvised in the moment. It was the work of someone with experience in tying knots, possibly someone in the military, a scout, or maybe someone with outdoor skills. This detail pointed to a calculated attack rather than someone that did this on impulse. That binding left deep indentations and bruising on Julie's wrist, indicating that she had been restrained for an extended period of time. There were also ligature marks around her ankles, though no bindings were found at the scene. This suggested that the killer had tied her up during this attack, only to remove the restraints later, possibly to avoid leaving them behind. The autopsy also revealed clear evidence of a forced sex act. The bruising and the tearing was consistent with that. And there was male biological material recovered from her body. The medical examiner preserved this material very carefully because even though DNA testing in 1984 was still in its infancy, investigators would have it preserved in case technology advanced. At the time, they could only use this to determine things like blood type. Despite these limitations, though, preserving this male DNA was a crucial piece of evidence. Just in case they were to find a suspect, then they could match it. For Julie's family, the autopsy findings were devastating. The raw details of her injuries, clinical and detached on paper, brought an unbearable sense of what Julie had endured. Kathy Connell later said that she couldn't stop imagining her daughter's final moments, the pain that she must have felt, and her fight to survive. For Jim, the discovery of the bindings on Julie's wrist left him haunted by the thought of her being helpless, completely at the mercy of this monster. The brutality of the attack indicated that this killer was not a novice. The detectives couldn't shake the suspicion that whoever had done this to Julie might have done this before and would probably do it again. So the community, of course, was haunted by that fear. The fallout from Julie's murder rippled through San Leandro. For a place that had always felt safe with white picket fences, neighborhood cookouts, that classic Main Street USA vibe, this kind of violence was almost unthinkable. Parents would clutch their kids tighter, and they were paranoid. Kennedy Park used to be a place for laughter and picnics, but now it was a reminder of what they had lost. Some parents even stopped letting their kids play outside altogether. Others warned their teens to never, ever go anywhere alone. Julie's murder wasn't just a tragedy, it was also a wake-up call that this could happen to anyone. To be safe, to be aware. The investigators left Castro Valley with more questions than answers. Who had brought Julie to this isolated corral? How had they overpowered her in broad daylight in a public park? And most importantly, who had done something so cruel? Julie's body might have been evidence of a horrific final chapter, but it wasn't the end of her story. For her family and the police, it was a fight for justice, and it only just started. Now, it's hard to imagine, but in the 1980s, investigations were painfully slow by today's standards. There was no Google, no DNA databases, no way to ping someone's phone because they didn't even have a phone, so no one could even tell where your last location was. Everything relied on witnesses, physical evidence, and honestly, a bit of luck. And if a case didn't get solved within the first few weeks, it slipped into what we now call cold case territory, a file that would just gather dust in the corner of a precinct. One of the earliest challenges in this case came from the location that Julie had disappeared from and then where she was discovered. Kennedy Park, where Julie was last seen, fell under the jurisdiction of Hayward Police Department. However, the canyon in Castro Valley where her body was found was under the Alameda County Sheriff's Department. So this split jurisdiction caused confusion and delays, and authorities would debate who should take the lead. I mean, like, that's the most important thing, but I guess Somebody has to start on the case. So detectives from both agencies worked the case at the same time. But then there were so many disconnections between these departments that it slowed the communication and the information sharing. So it was just very discombobulated. And the Connell family was painfully aware of all these bureaucratic delays from the very beginning, because the words of one Hayward police sergeant haunted them from way back when Julie had first vanished. He said, "We simply can't stop everything because one person is missing. We just don't have the resources." For Julie's parents, those words felt like a dismissal of their daughter's life. Everyone's life is important, even one person. They believed that precious time was lost during the critical first days that Julie had disappeared. And as this investigation dragged on, the parents' frustration only grew. Eventually, it was decided that the Hayward Police Department would take control of Julie's case. And their first question, how had Julie been abducted from Kennedy Park without anyone noticing? And that question led them back to where Julie had last been seen. Detectives tried to retrace her last steps. They combed through the area near the spot where she had spread out on her blanket, hoping to find a clue that everyone had missed. Unfortunately, time had passed since she disappeared, and the park was a high-traffic area. Any forensic evidence that might have been left behind was long gone. Still, the investigators pushed forward. They canvassed the entire area for witnesses. Julie's sister Wendy, the last person to see her, said she left around 1:50, and she described Julie sitting calmly with her book, surrounded by families enjoying the sunshine that day. Wendy had left the park to see a movie with friends, and when she said goodbye, she crossed the street to the festival cinema. When she returned, her sister was gone. Other park goers confirmed seeing Julie that afternoon, but no one reported hearing a scream or witnessing anything they thought was suspicious. With the investigation stalling, detectives decided to try something unconventional, a reenactment of Julie's last known moments, and they convinced the local media to record it, to cover it, to put it to the public. They believed that staging her visit to Kennedy Park could possibly jog someone's memory and produce a breakthrough that they desperately needed. Now, what was really interesting was that Wendy agreed to step into her sister's shoes, literally. She wore the same lavender shirt and blue jeans that Julie had been wearing the day that she disappeared and was killed. She sat in the same spot that Julie had, spreading out on her blanket. The reenactment drew a lot of media attention. Of course it did. I mean, nothing like this was really happening back then, but there was a ton of cameras capturing Wendy's quiet bravery as she was just sitting there, mimicking her sister's final moments. However, Jim and Kathy were concerned. They knew that Wendy's participation could play a crucial role in unraveling the truth. While they understood the potential risks, they believed that Wendy's involvement could bring justice to their daughter. The detectives working on Julie's case admitted that they got the idea for this reenactment of her last sighting at Kennedy Park from San Francisco police, because they used a similar method in their investigation of a 10-year-old little boy, Kevin Collins, who disappeared on February 10th of 1984, and he was still missing, and he still is today. Kathy Connell attended this reenactment, and when the media approached her and asked her why she was there, she replied, "It's my daughter who got killed. I'm home. I've got a lot of time on my hands." And that made me really sad that they didn't even know that she was the mother of the victim and then actually asked her why she was sitting there. And it was also sad that she had so much time on her hands and thought that it would be right to use it to be a part of this. The reenactment of Julie's last sighting in Kennedy Park proved to be instrumental in solving her case, because a call came in to detectives. It was an employee of a store called Mervyn's. It was a department store nearby, and they informed them that the company had been having an Easter party in the park for an employee's family on the day that Julie went missing. This lead prompted detectives to interview everyone who attended the Mervyn's event. They were hoping to uncover any suspicious behavior or gather information about someone who might have seen Julie's abduction. Now, the closest thing that came to a lead from this was one of the employees from Mervyn's remembered seeing Julie near the mini train ride that circled the park. According to his statement, he rode that train, which lasted only a few minutes, and when it returned, Julie was no longer there. So he saw her when he got on the train, but by the time the train circled back, she was no longer on her blanket, and everything was gone. Now, another lead was that the detectives were able to gather up photographs that were taken from this event in the park. Now, these photos depicted various events throughout that day, including the arrival of the staff at the park, the setup of the gathering, the barbecue, ice cream party, and even an Easter egg hunt. And one of the pictures taken around noon focused on the area where Julie had been sitting. But unfortunately, the detectives could not identify any potential clues. By now, forensics had completed an analysis on the fingerprints on the gate. And unfortunately, this wasn't a lead. They belonged to the ranchers who discovered Julie's body. And the muddy footprint that was on the rail also provided no immediate matches. And this led detectives frustrated without a solid suspect. While DNA technology in 1984 was very limited, the sample did allow forensic experts to establish some basic traits about the perpetrator, including his blood type and the fact that he had reddish blonde hair. Further analysis revealed that the scalpel wrapping, remember that, the one that was discovered at the corral, that actually ended up belonging to a rancher who used it while he was out there one day. So by now it looks like the investigators are at a dead end. What they have is the biological material, and it's taken and frozen awaiting an advance in technology or to be matched to a suspect at some point. They also had wound analysis, the pattern of the cuts. This suggested a sharp object was used, and they were trying to look for any weapons to compare it to. And then they also had that binding technique, an intricate knot that was documented in detail. So the investigators began exploring whether this could be connected to any other crimes. Meanwhile, they looked into whether Julie's murder might be connected to some unsolved homicides in their area. Just weeks earlier, 14-year-old Tina Fields was stabbed to death near her junior high school. In December of the previous year, 14-year-old Kelly Poppleton had been beaten and stabbed to death. Both cases had very chilling similarities to Julie's, and detectives wondered if they were dealing with the same killer, maybe a serial killer. To explore this possibility, the Alameda County Sheriff's Department formed a task force to investigate the links between these murders. Detectives dug into every detail from the locations of the crimes, the type of wounds inflicted on the victims, but despite their efforts, no solid connections emerged. It seemed that Julie's murder was an isolated act of violence, or at least no one could prove otherwise at this point. The lack of progress weighed heavily on Julie's family. Jim and Kathy Connell, who had been relentless in their search for answers, were beginning to feel the strain. The constant media appearances, the long nights, replaying every detail of Julie's last day, the crushing weight of not knowing was exhausting. For Wendy and Patricia, their sister's murder was a shadow that hung over every aspect of their lives. Wendy later admitted that playing in that reenactment was an honor, but it was also a burden. It kept her sister's memory alive, but it also forced her to relive the trauma. For Patricia, every memory of Julie felt like a punch to her chest. She couldn't look at her sister's books or hear her favorite songs without breaking down in tears. 1 month after Julie's murder, the Connell family began to receive very threatening phone calls at their house. And these calls would come in very late at night, usually around 11 p.m., and they would taunt the entire family, but in particular, Julie's younger sisters, Wendy and Patricia. The caller would actually whisper very chilling words, things like, "I knew your sister, I'm going to do the exact same thing to you." It was disgusting. And the Connell family was terrified by these calls, and obviously they sought the assistance from the police. To track the caller's identity, the police set up a trace on the phone line, and through their efforts, they actually traced the call to a specific person. However, to their disappointment and surprise actually, this person making the calls was just some prankster that thought this was funny. That's really sick humor. And even though they had this malicious intent to cause them to be scared and terrified, they had nothing to do with Julie's murder. I don't see why someone would do a twisted prank like this and try to distress this family further, but people do this stuff. The investigation itself had actually stalled, and as time passed, there were no answers. And the Connell family was even more frustrated. They started to think they would never uncover their daughter's killer. The days actually turned into weeks, the weeks turned into months, and years went by without finding the perpetrator. One detective informed the Connell family that they may never know the identity of the person that killed their daughter. This detective warned them not to be surprised if this case remained unsolved. But we're here today talking about it, so you already know they found the killer. Julie's room became a shrine to her memory. It was left exactly the way it was before she disappeared. Her books, her trinkets, even her purse was still in there, containing the money that she carefully saved. It was all left untouched. It served as a painful reminder of the life that she had left behind. The community's initial outpouring of support gradually faded as the years passed, but for the Connell family, the wound still remained raw. They refused to let Julie's case just fade into nothing, and they continued to fight for justice, even as the trail grew cold. Over a decade went by, which I can't even imagine all of that time passing. The leads fizzled out, potential suspects came and they went, and investigators were left with nothing but unanswered questions. And by the late 1990s, it really seemed like Julie's case would join countless other cold cases, just filed away and forgotten. But what Julie's family didn't know at that point, what no one knew, was that science was quietly catching up to her killer. The DNA evidence collected from Julie's autopsy, once little more than a footnote in the case file, was about to become the key to unlocking the mystery that haunted them for years. So let's fast forward to when technology made leaps and bounds. The creation of the Combined DNA Index System, or CODIS, allowed law enforcement to compare DNA profiles from crime scenes against a national database of offenders, and suddenly cases that had been ice cold for many, many years started to thaw. 14 years after the murder of Julie Connell, the district attorney's office decided to reopen her case, and they sent that DNA evidence collected from her body for analysis. This process is slow, it's meticulous, and the sample was fragile after years in storage, and it had to be carefully prepared to avoid contamination or just degradation. However, the district attorney, Angela Backers, discovered that the DNA collected from Julie's body in 1984 was no longer even compatible with the newly established CODIS database. So this was really disappointing. But she was determined to uncover the identity of Julie's killer, and this is all she had. So she got some assistance from a friend who also was a renowned forensic scientist. And he had this ingenious system that was able to cross-check older DNA profiles. Knowing that time was of the essence, Angela read the DNA profile over the phone, hoping that the scientist could uncover any promising leads. And then after weeks of waiting, the results came back. Surprisingly, there was a match. The DNA belonged to a convicted murderer who was already sitting on California's death row. His name? Robert Boyd Rhodes. Robert was never an initial suspect in Julie's murder. He was never even on their radar. They hadn't even heard his name before. But Robert Rhodes had an extensive criminal history. So they were right about one thing. He had done this before. And if the name Robert Boyd Rhodes doesn't send a chill down your spine because you never heard it before, it will after you hear this. By the time his DNA was linked to Julie's case, Robert was already infamous for another brutal crime. In 1996, he kidnapped, tortured, and killed an 8-year-old little boy named Michael Lyons in Yuba City, California, a crime that was so horrifying it made national headlines. And I can't even tell you the details here because they're that bad. 8-year-old Michael Lyons was just walking home from school when he vanished. He lived with his mother, Sandra Friend, and stepfather, and had 2 younger sisters. The family lived in an apartment about a mile from Bridge Street School, and Sandra was a stay-at-home mother, while Michael's stepfather worked as a painter. They were very hardworking people, and Michael was the type of kid who made friends easily. He would stay after class to help his teachers, he would make jokes to brighten someone's day, and even brought flowers to a girl that he liked. One neighbor of Michael's later told the FBI he had witnessed the boy walking home from school. The neighbor said he saw Michael, and he was playing in the park between Yuba Sutter Fairgrounds and Michael's apartment complex. This witness added that he had seen a man drive up next to Michael and start talking to him. According to the neighbor, the man grabbed Michael and pulled him into his truck. Now, initially, and this surprised me, the witness was not alarmed by this because he said that Michael didn't appear to resist the man. And I'm thinking, this is an 8-year-old little boy. How is he supposed to resist this person who grabbed him and threw him into a truck? But somehow this witness assumed that the child knew this person. Now, less than 24 hours after 8-year-old Michael Lyons was abducted, his body was discovered at 10:52 a.m. in dense brush along Feather River. less than 2.5 miles from the school that he went to. It was clear to the detectives who were working on his case that he had been murdered. Sadly, they found 70 to 80 shallow knife marks on Michael's body with a fisherman-style fillet knife, and the way that these wounds were made indicated that this poor boy was tortured. He was kept alive for hours as he was inflicted with unspeakable pain. However, the cause of death was determined to be a stab wound to his neck and back, severing his spinal cord. He clutched on to his silver bracelet in his hand, which was a heartbreaking detail that hinted at the small comfort that he clung to in his final moments. Detectives also discovered indications that Michael had been violated prior to his murder. He was found nude from the waist down with a dark green sweater pulled up over his head. Between Michael's body and the river, which was 10 to 15 feet away, was a blood-stained blanket. Robert Rhodes was discovered by the police when his truck got stuck in the mud about a half a mile from the location where Michael Lyons' body had been discovered. When Robert was found, he was sitting motionless in his driver's seat wearing wet blue jeans and was completely shirtless and barefoot. His demeanor was eerily calm, but his presence there was suspicious. And upon further examination, the police noted a cable attached to a winch which was wrapped around the truck's rear axle, and this line was secured to a tree. On the open tailgate was a fishing knife, a thin-bladed fillet knife with a serrated edge. The knife had blood and river soil in the corners where the blade met the handle, and DNA testing later showed that the blood on the handle crevices was Michael's. Once Robert was in police custody, the detectives discovered that he was a barber and a resident of a small town called Sutter. However, further investigation revealed that Robert's picture was listed in a book of 892 child S offenders, which was intended to provide the community with a way of safeguarding themselves against monsters like this. I think somehow back in the day that wasn't really an efficient way of, documenting and putting it out to the public who they should be aware of in their community. Now I think it might be easier because we have the internet. You can clearly just look it up. But that's the way they did it back then. For Michael's family, this loss altered their lives. Sandra Friend, Michael's mother, described her son as the heart of their home. He was just a happy 8-year-old kid who liked playing shortstop on his baseball team. Losing him in such a violent, senseless way shattered her entire world. Sandra later recounted how she would sit by herself for hours thinking about the 10 hours of torture Michael endured. She couldn't stop imagining her son's pain, how scared he must have been, and the evil he faced in his final moments. She said, "It took me many, many years to come to terms with what happened to Michael. There's so much hurt and anger and despair when someone takes your child. Your whole being is ripped out, and you have to rebuild it very, very slowly." As a mom, I can't even start to imagine that, but I think my mind would do the same exact thing and just keep replaying those terrible moments over and over again. The emotional devastation did not stop with Sandra. Her husband, Michael's stepfather, turned to alcohol as a coping mechanism, and her daughters, Michael's sisters, they struggled to make sense of his loss. Michael's younger sister, Alethea, only 5 years old at the time, later shared how deeply it impacted her entire childhood. She described waiting for her brother on their apartment steps, wrapped in his Spider-Man blanket, not knowing if he would ever come home. Once she became an adult, she recalled how the murder turned her family's world upside down. She said, "Each one of my family members died that day in their very own way. I'm 25 years old and I'm still afraid of the dark." The trauma shaped her entire life, just as it did for Sandra and the rest of their family. Michael's mother's grief could have consumed her, but instead, she found the strength in fighting for change. She threw herself into advocacy work, channeling her pain into efforts to protect other families from enduring the same nightmare. She became an outspoken supporter of laws targeting offenders, including California's Megan's Law, which allows the public to access information about registered offenders in their communities. Sandra worked tirelessly to educate parents about the tools to keep their children safe. She often spoke at schools. She would warn children about the dangers of strangers and empowered them to recognize unsafe situations. Her advocacy extended beyond her local community. She testified before lawmakers. She participated in rallies and even collaborated with other parents who lost children to violent crimes. In memory of her son, Michael, Sandra established the Michael Lyons Foundation, which is dedicated to raising awareness about crimes against children and supporting families of victims. But this was all after Robert had already committed a number of crimes and was now linked to Julie's murder. He had once robbed a woman at a store right near the park where Julie disappeared, and later he forged 2 checks from the woman's bank account. Back in 1985, only 1 year after Julie Connell's murder, Robert attacked another woman in Yuba County. He gained entry to her home, he held her at gunpoint, and threatened her life if she didn't give him her money. Then he handcuffed her to a chair. He violated her, and then when he was finished, his words were chilling. He said, "This is like Bonnie and Clyde, but Bonnie is not gonna make it." He put her into his truck, and he drove towards the river. This woman, in a desperate act of survival, managed to jump from this truck, from the moving vehicle, and Robert then reversed the truck towards her, trying to hit her, but she managed to roll underneath. She recognized her opportunity to flee, and she ran to a nearby building. And Robert was then arrested and convicted of kidnapping and a forced sex act. But he wasn't locked up for long. And once he was released, he went right back to his old ways. And in 1993, he violated a 4-year-old, a granddaughter of the woman that he was dating at the time. And this crime resulted in yet another conviction for lewd acts against a child, cementing his status as a predator who would prey on the vulnerable. But despite these convictions, and this always seemed to happen, especially in older cases, Robert remained free for most of his life, just quietly moving through California like a shadow. And Robert was convicted of Michael's murder and finally sentenced to death in 1999. And by 2002, his DNA was now matched to Julie's case. The brutal similarities between her murder and Michael's painted a very terrifying picture of who a person like Robert was. He was cold, and he was calculating. He was a killer who derived pleasure from inflicting great pain. He wasn't just a murderer, he was also a predator, and he thrived on controlling and destroying people's lives. He also didn't pick gender. He didn't care who it was. If it was a vulnerable person, they were fair game for him. But investigators wondered, would the similarities be enough to convict him? The district attorney wasn't sure that they'd be able to secure a conviction against Robert, who would have been 31 at the time he killed Julie, just based on the DNA evidence alone. Now you're thinking, DNA evidence, isn't that a surefire sign that he did this? Well, not exactly, because you probably realize that the defense is going to insist that sure, there might have been a sexual encounter, but it was consensual. And of course, that's what they planned to say in this case. So the investigators knew they had to find something else connecting this man to Julie's murder. And this was so many years later, so they were racking their brain, trying to figure out what other evidence and clues they can look for. And there was no one more invested in this case, other than her family, than the district attorney, Angela Backers. She was relentless. She scoured the evidence piece by piece, not even sleeping, and spending every waking hour trying to find a connection. And finally, she was able to locate one of Robert's ex-girlfriends who he was dating back in 1984. And that ex-girlfriend revealed 2 very important details. 1, he had been living less than a block away from Kennedy Park, where Julie had been last seen. And 2, he drove a green truck at the time. Now, the green truck gave Angela an idea. What if he had driven that same green truck that day and parked it somewhere at Kennedy Park, where he took Julie? She remembered all of those pictures that were collected from the employees of Mervyn's department store who had that party that day at the park. And she looked at each and every one of them, trying to see if she could spot a vehicle that matched the description of the green truck. And I actually got chills when I heard an interview with Angela when she said that she was so fed up, and so many detectives had already looked through all these photographs time and time again for so many years with nothing. So she actually prayed, but she prayed to Julie. She was like, please, please give me something to go on, please. And then she grabbed a magnifying glass and she went corner to corner, up and down, and she couldn't believe it. In a somewhat blurry photo, an old, bad quality photograph, there it was, a green truck. And then she scanned down from the truck and she couldn't believe it. There was Julie on the blanket. Now, it's very hard to make out the details, but the colors tell a story. The blanket, her shirt, it was her. And the truck, it was there at the same time. And this proved it. It was the link that they needed. All of the evidence combined provided the district attorney with sufficient evidence to charge Robert Rhodes with the murder of Julie Connell. Now, the weight of the past was heavy for Julie's family. The news that Robert had been identified as her killer, of course, brought a mixture of relief, but also heartbreak. The revelation that this man had gone on to murder Michael Lyons and potentially harmed others in the years between when Julie disappeared to when he was found was devastating. Julie's sisters, Wendy and Patricia, were now adults, and each of them were grappling with their own memories of their sister that they lost. Kathy Connell reflected on the long years of just waiting and waiting. She said, "You hold on to the hope for so long, but when the truth finally comes, it's so much worse than you imagined." And in 2007, 23 years after Julie's murder, the Alameda County District Attorney's Office prepared to take Robert to trial. Now, by this time, he was already on death row for Michael Lyons' murder, but prosecutors were determined to hold him accountable for Julie's murder as well. And I really respected that, because I've seen cases where this is not done because the person is already serving a death or life sentence. But in this case, they went forward. The prosecution's theory was that after Julie was done studying, she began to pack up all of her belongings into her backpack, her blanket, her book, and other items, and was possibly going to walk home, which was not too far away from the park. No one can know for sure what happened next, but they think that Robert either somehow convinced Julie to get close enough to his truck to snag her and throw her inside. Maybe he asked her a simple question, or maybe he was just fast enough to grab her after watching her for some time as she sat on the blanket in the park. It doesn't matter how he kidnapped her, because once he did, he forced himself on her, and then he brought her out to the corral and took her life. The defense wasted no time crafting a counter-narrative, knowing that the DNA evidence would be central to the prosecution's case. They, of course, argued that 31-year-old Robert and Julie, only 18, had been in a committed, consensual relationship. This claim shocked and angered Julie's family. She had a boyfriend at the time. She was just turned 18. There was no way that she was having any kind of relations with this 31-year-old murderer. Robert's sister, though, even testified, claiming that she saw the two together and she described them as a couple. I don't know why a family member would have the audacity to essentially get on the stand and lie for their family member who's already committed a heinous crime, but to each their own. The defense also attempted to highlight the passage of time, suggesting that the decades between Julie's murder and the trial would muddy the evidence. But the prosecution countered by showing how carefully this DNA sample had been preserved and how the advancements in technology had finally allowed justice to be served. For prosecutors, the defense claims were not only absurd, but they were deeply insulting to Julie's memory. They worked tirelessly to dismantle this narrative, highlighting Julie's character, her aspirations, and the lack of any evidence supporting the defense's version of events. This trial was obviously grueling for Julie's family. They were forced to relive every detail of her brutal murder, but they listened as prosecutors described the DNA evidence that linked Robert to Julie and the striking similarities between her case and his other crimes. A key moment came when the prosecution played a video of Julie performing on stage, showing her vibrant personality and the bright future that she had ahead of her. For the jurors, it was a stark reminder of the life that was stolen from her and the magnitude of this crime. The jury also saw the photographic evidence that placed Robert's green truck at Kennedy Park on the day that Julie disappeared. It was a critical piece of this puzzle that tied him to the scene of the crime and reinforced the timeline of events. After 4 weeks of testimony, the jury deliberated in less than an hour before delivering their verdict. Robert Boyd Rhodes was guilty of the murder of Julie Connell, and her family wept as the decision was read. For them, it was a moment of profound relief and vindication. Her dad said, "We waited so long for this. It doesn't bring her back, but at least we know he can't hurt anyone else." And one of the most emotional moments of the trial came when Julie's parents delivered their impact statements. Jim stood before the court. His voice was steady, but it was also filled with emotion. He was determined to talk for his daughter. He described her as bright and ambitious and spoke about her love for books, her dreams of becoming a teacher, and the hole her death had left in their family. He said, "We've spent every day since April 1984 wondering what Julie's life could have been like. Would she have gotten married, had children, made a difference in the world? We'll never know, because Robert Rhodes took all of that away." Kathy Connell followed him, describing the pain of losing Julie as a weight that she carried every day. She said no parent should have to bury their child, and no family should have to wait nearly 20 years for justice. Wendy and Patty also spoke, and they shared their memories of their sister and how her murder had shaped their entire lives. Patricia, who was just 12 at the time, told the jury how she struggled with fear and anxiety growing up, always wondering if the same thing was going to happen to her. The jury eventually recommended the death penalty, making Robert Rhodes one of the few individuals in California to receive multiple death sentences, and the judge upheld this recommendation, sentencing Robert Rhodes to death for Julie's murder. And as the family left the courtroom, Kathy reflected, saying, "This will not bring her back, but now she can rest. We can rest." For the Connell family, the verdict brought a sense of closure, but not the end of their grief. Jim and Kathy continue to advocate for victims' rights, sharing Julie's story in hope that it will inspire other families to keep fighting for justice. And Wendy and Patty carried their sister's memory with them into adulthood. They were determined to honor the life that she could have lived. The San Leandro community also found some peace in this outcome. Kennedy Park was once a place of joy, and it had turned to sorrow, but then it became a symbol of resilience. A small memorial bench was placed there in Julie's honor. It was a reminder that she was more than just a victim. She was a daughter, a sister, and a bright light that was extinguished too soon. Julie Connell's story is one that will linger after the trial ends, not just because of the horrifying nature of her murder, but because of the resilience, the determination, and the love that her family showed in the face of an unimaginable loss. It's a story that reminds us of the fragility of life, the importance of vigilance, and the power of never giving up. For the Connell family, justice did not come easily or quickly for them. It came after nearly 2 decades of heartbreak and unanswered questions. Their persistence, their refusal to let Julie's case be forgotten, and their willingness to fight for her memory are powerful lessons of courage and hope. But there's another takeaway, one that speaks to all of us: the importance of community. In the aftermath of Julie's disappearance, her family leaned on friends, neighbors, and even strangers who helped them. They helped to pass out flyers, they joined search parties, and they shared her story. And the same was true for Sandra Friend and her fight to honor her son, Michael Lyons. This shows us that when things like this happen, it's really important for collective action to be taken, and it can make a major difference in cases like this. Now, more so than ever, social media can be a good thing, even if some people see it as a bad thing. Having a community to be searching, even creating websites and passing information along on things like Facebook. That's how cases like Gabby Petito's ended up being solved. And of course, we have a lot more technology. We have cameras everywhere, people taking photos and using their devices, so they're bound to capture something. Julie's story also shows the need for advancements in technology and the role that they play in justice. DNA technology, which didn't even exist in 1984, became the turning point in solving Julie's case. And it's a reminder of how science, when paired with persistence, can uncover truths that time alone cannot erase. So I know that not everyone's going to agree with what I say next, but I think it's very important, if you feel so inclined, that you put your DNA into a database like GEDmatch or similar ones so they can help solve crimes like this. It's happening more and more. Genetic genealogy is being used to go back in time and link people to murders. I recently saw a TikTok about a girl who did just that and ultimately sent a relative that she had never even met to jail. It's crazy, right? Well, I just want to thank you so much for being here for Julie's story today. I really hope you share it with someone, and I will see you in my next video. Bye.